Boston Harbor, 1806. A ship called the Favorite sits at the dock, and its hold is packed with neither spices, nor cloth, nor weapons. This hold is packed with ice, ordinary lake ice, cut with axes and saws from the frozen ponds of New England. People on the docks are laughing. An investor named Frederic Tudor is about to ship this ice 3,000 miles, through the tropics, to the island of Martinique, where the temperature almost never drops below 25 degrees Celsius. Local newspapers call it Tudor's Folly. The voyage takes weeks. The sun bakes the whole day and night. Common sense says that by the time the ship arrives, nothing will be left of the cargo but warm water sloshing across the deck. But when the ship finally drops anchor off the coast of Martinique, there are still tons of solid, clear ice sitting in the hold. Tudor loses money on this first voyage, because no one on the island has ever seen ice before and no one has the faintest idea what to do with it. But he does not give up. And less than 30 years later, that same man will be shipping ice from the frozen lakes of Massachusetts to India, China, and the Middle East, and his company will become one of the most profitable shipping enterprises in America. The story of how cold water, frozen in a New England winter, became a global commodity is the story of how humanity spent centuries hunting for cold, spending entire fortunes to obtain it, and eventually made it so ordinary that today almost no one stops to think about where the ice cubes in their glass actually come from. But long before Tudor, long before ships and Massachusetts lakes, ice was already a luxury available only to the privileged few. Persia, around 400 BCE. In the middle of a scorching desert, where summer temperatures easily climb past 40 degrees Celsius, Persian engineers build something extraordinary. Yakhchals. These are tall, cone-shaped towers made of clay and a special lime-based mortar, capable of preserving ice even in the height of summer. The ice for them was harvested in winter from artificial pools, and sometimes brought down from distant mountain peaks. The thick walls of the yakhchal, its domed shape, and an underground network of channels created a natural ventilation system that cooled the interior enough for ice to last for months, sometimes all the way until the following winter. Some of these towers, remarkably, are still standing today 2,500 years later. Persian nobility used this ice not only to chill drinks but also to prepare faluda, a sweet frozen dessert and one of the earliest known ancestors of modern ice cream. In ancient Rome, the hunger for cold took on an almost theatrical scale. Emperors, including Nero, sent messengers into the mountains to fetch snow, which was then carried down on litters, wrapped in straw and animal hides, to the city below. This snow was mixed with honey, fruit juice, and wine to create a dessert that only Roman nobility could afford, since behind every bowl of chilled wine lay days of grueling travel across mountain passes carried out by slaves and servants. Snow and ice in Rome often cost more than many staple foods, because every serving of cooled wine represented an entire logistical operation stretched across the landscape. In China, ice was harvested and stored in dedicated ice cellars as far back as the Zhou dynasty, more than 3,000 years ago. There was even an official government post, an officer responsible for the harvesting, storage, and distribution of ice at the imperial court. Ice was used not only to chill the beverages of the nobility, but also to preserve food and, just as importantly, to play a role in ceremonial rites honoring ancestors. Across all three civilizations, Persian, Roman, and Chinese, the same pattern repeats itself. Cold was never just a pleasant sensation. It was a symbol of power. Whoever could make water freeze in the middle of summer, whoever could bring snow down from the mountains into a sweltering capital, was demonstrating control over nature itself. For the ordinary person, this was simply out of reach. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire, large-scale state systems for harvesting ice largely disappeared from Europe, but the tradition never died out completely. Wealthy European landowners built ice houses on their estates. deep underground pits or stone cellars lined with straw and sawdust, into which ice cut from frozen ponds and rivers was packed every winter. A well-built ice house could preserve its cold almost until the following winter. Owning a private ice house on an estate was a mark of wealth comparable to keeping a large stable or a private vineyard. In the 17th century, chilled desserts and drinks became fashionable at the royal courts of France and Italy. It is widely believed that Italian cooks at the Medici court were among the first to experiment with freezing fruit juices and cream, mixing ice with salt to lower the freezing point and achieve a smoother, creamier texture. This technique gradually spread across the aristocratic courts of Europe and became the foundation of what would later evolve into modern ice cream. But for the vast majority of Europe's population, peasants, craftsmen, the urban poor, ice in summer remained completely out of reach. Preserving cold was simply too expensive, and building an ice house was affordable only to those who owned land and controlled labor. An ordinary person might taste a frozen delicacy once in a lifetime by chance while working in the household of a noble family, or never taste one at all. This deep inequality would eventually become the very soil from which one of the strangest trading empires in history would grow centuries later, an empire built, quite literally, on frozen water. Let's return to New England in the early 19th century. Frederic Tudor, the son of a well-off Boston lawyer, was obsessed with a single idea: turning the ice that lay, quite literally, underfoot every winter on frozen ponds into a commodity that people in hot countries would pay enormous sums of money for. The idea struck his contemporaries as so absurd that it was openly mocked in the newspapers, and Tudor himself spent years teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. His early voyages failed one after another. Sometimes the ice melted en route, sometimes there were no storage facilities waiting on the other end, and no customers who even understood what the strange cargo was for. The turning point came when Tudor partnered with an engineer named Nathaniel Wyeth, who proposed a solution that changed everything: insulating ship holds and storage warehouses with sawdust. Sawdust, a waste byproduct of the timber industry that had previously been simply burned or discarded, turned out to be a nearly ideal insulating material. Trapped cold and dramatically slowed melting. Almost overnight, the losses of ice during long ocean voyages dropped from catastrophic levels to entirely manageable ones. Tudor also invested in specialized cutting equipment, including the ice plow, an invention credited to Wyeth himself, which allowed workers to cut a frozen pond surface into neat rectangular blocks far faster than could ever be done by hand with axes. These uniform blocks were easier to stack, store, and transport, and their tight, gap-free packing further reduced melting. By the 1830s, Tudor's business had grown into a genuine empire. Ice from the lakes of Massachusetts, most famously from Walden Pond, the very same pond that Henry David Thoreau would later immortalize in his philosophical writings, was being shipped to Calcutta, Rio de Janeiro, Havana, New Orleans, and even Hong Kong. The voyage from Boston to Calcutta took roughly 4 months, and yet the ice still arrived in sufficient quantities to make the trade extraordinarily profitable. In India itself, Tudor's ice became something of a sensation among British colonial officials suffering through unbearable heat. Chilled butter, chilled wine, and chilled drinks suddenly became available to people who had previously only been able to dream of them in letters home. By the middle of the 19th century, ice had become one of New England's leading export commodities, and Walden Pond and dozens of other ponds around Boston were transformed each winter into noisy industrial work sites, where hundreds of laborers cut, stacked, and loaded thousands of tons of ice. By the middle of the 19th century, ice harvesting had become one of the largest seasonal industries in the United States. Every winter, thousands of seasonal laborers gathered on the frozen lakes of the northern states, Massachusetts, Maine, New York, Wisconsin. They marked the surface of the ice into neat squares using horse-drawn marking tools, then cut the blocks with saws and ice plows and hauled them onto the shore with iron hooks, where the blocks were loaded onto sleds, trains, or barges. The work was brutal and dangerous. Men drowned after falling through the ice, suffered injuries from sharp tools, and endured severe frostbite in the bitter cold. And yet this industry fed entire small towns. With the spread of the railroads, the geography of the ice trade expanded dramatically. Ice could now be delivered not only by ship to distant ports, but by train deep into the interior, to cities that had never seen a frozen lake anywhere nearby. By the 1880s, almost every major American city had its own ice delivery profession, the iceman, who delivered blocks of ice door to door by wagon, while housewives placed a special card in the window indicating how many pounds of ice they needed that day. A new piece of furniture appeared in homes. The icebox, a wooden cabinet lined on the inside with tin and insulated with straw or cork, into which a block of ice was loaded, with food stored underneath, kept from spoiling thanks to the cold radiating downward. This wooden icebox, long before the invention of the electric refrigerator, was what first allowed ordinary city families, not aristocrats, not landowners, but working-class families and shopkeepers, to keep fresh meat, milk, and butter safe during the hot summer months. By the close of the 19th century, the American ice industry was valued at tens of millions of dollars and had become one of the essential pillars of urban life. Without a steady supply of ice, the entire system of perishable food storage collapsed. Meat markets, dairy farms, and even hospitals where ice was used to bring down fevers in patients all depended on it. But natural ice had one fundamental problem that became increasingly obvious as cities grew larger. The lakes and ponds from which ice was harvested sat close to expanding towns, and the bigger those towns became, the more polluted their waters grew with household and industrial waste. By the 1890s, doctors had begun linking outbreaks of typhoid fever and other infectious diseases directly to the use of contaminated natural ice for cooling food and drinks. The very substance that had, for centuries, been seen as a safe alternative to spoiled food was now revealed as a potential source of contamination itself. At the same time, an entirely different technology was developing: mechanical artificial refrigeration. As early as the 1850s, an American physician named John Gorrie, working in Florida and trying to ease the suffering of patients with malaria and yellow fever in the tropical heat, built one of the first working machines for manufacturing artificial ice, based on the principle of compressing and expanding air. Gorrie believed that artificial cold could save lives in places where it was physically impossible to deliver natural ice from the distant north. His invention was ahead of its time and failed commercially, in part because of fierce resistance from the powerful natural ice lobby, which understood perfectly well the threat posed by a machine that could manufacture ice anywhere, at any time. Later, in France, engineer Ferdinand Carré refined the technology of absorption refrigeration, and by the end of the 19th century dozens of engineers on both sides of the Atlantic were competing to build the first reliable, affordable industrial ice-making plant. The decisive blow to the natural ice industry came from the sanitation problem itself. Artificial ice, manufactured from clean, often distilled water in a factory, was objectively safer than murky lake ice harvested next to a growing industrial city. By the early 20th century, artificial ice plants had sprung up everywhere, including across the American South, a region that Tudor's natural ice had once taken months to reach by sea. It is one of history's small ironies that the hot southern states, lacking frozen lakes of their own, became some of the strongest drivers of the shift toward artificial refrigeration, simply because they had no other choice. The next decisive leap came in the early 20th century, when engineers learned to shrink compression cooling units down to a size that could fit inside an individual household, rather than only inside an industrial plant. In 1913, one of the first electric home refrigeration units appeared, known as the Domelre, which was installed directly on top of an ordinary wooden icebox, transforming it into an appliance that no longer needed daily deliveries of ice blocks. But the real turning point came in the 1920s, when major manufacturers, including General Electric with its famous monitor top model, introduced in 1927, began producing compact, relatively affordable refrigerators for the mass market. The shape of this refrigerator, a round compressor unit mounted on top, resembling a ship's gun turret or monitor, became so recognizable that it earned a lasting place in the history of industrial design. The price of a home refrigerator in the 1920s was still a substantial sum for an average American family, but the technology grew cheaper year after year as competition between manufacturers intensified. The profession of the iceman, which in the 1900s had seemed like a permanent fixture of city life, began to disappear rapidly. Thousands of families, whose income had depended for generations on cutting, storing, and delivering natural ice, found themselves out of work within the span of a single generation. By the 1940s and 1950s, the electric refrigerator had stopped being a luxury and had become standard equipment in the American home, and soon after in most homes across post-war Europe as well. For the first time in human history, an ordinary family could manufacture its own cold inside its own house, without depending on frozen lakes far to the north, without depending on the seasons, without depending on the weather at all. What Persian kings once built enormous clay towers to achieve, and what Roman emperors once dispatched messengers into the mountains to obtain, now fit inside a metal cabinet in the kitchen and cost less than a worker's monthly wage. The arrival of the home refrigerator gave rise to one more small but remarkably telling invention: the ice tray, and later the automatic ice maker built directly into the refrigerator door. What once required the labor of dozens of workers cutting tons of ice with axes on a frozen lake was now reduced to pouring water into a plastic tray and waiting a few hours. By the middle of the 20th century, the ice cube floating in a glass of a drink had become such an unremarkable detail of daily life that people stopped thinking about it at all. Frederic Tudor's ice trade, which had once generated enormous fortunes and required 4-month ocean voyages, was completely displaced within a matter of decades. Alongside this shift, the culture of chilled drinks itself transformed. Cocktail culture, which had first emerged in the 19th century partly thanks to the growing availability of ice, experienced a genuine boom after the Second World War in the United States and Europe, because ice had finally become available to virtually everyone at any time of year in any climate with no connection to the seasons whatsoever. Bars, restaurants, and hotels began installing industrial ice machines capable of producing hundreds of kilograms of ice per day, and by the end of the 20th century, entire companies had emerged specializing solely in selling bagged ice for retail stores, parties, and events. Direct, though far more modest, descendants of Tudor's business, except that their product now costs pennies rather than a fortune. While Tudor's ships were reshaping the ports of India and the Caribbean, another chapter of the same story was unfolding across the Atlantic, in Britain. For decades, the British had relied on their own modest domestic ice houses and on imports of Norwegian ice, cut from the fjords and shipped south across the North Sea. But in the 1840s, an enterprising businessman named William Leftwich began importing ice from a small pond in Massachusetts called Wenham Lake, marketed in London under the almost magical name Wenham Lake Ice. Leftwich went so far as to place a large block of this American ice in a shop window on the Strand, in central London, where curious crowds gathered daily to watch newspaper print remain perfectly legible through the solid, crystal-clear block. The stunt worked brilliantly. Wenham Lake ice became fashionable among the British upper and middle classes almost overnight, prized specifically for its clarity and its supposed purity compared to the cloudier, often algae-tinged ice harvested from local British ponds. Queen Victoria herself was said to have requested it for the royal household. For a time, so much ice was being shipped from small American ponds to satisfy London's sudden fashion for crystal-clear ice that some suppliers reportedly resorted to blending in ice from other, less picturesque sources and simply selling it under the same famous brand name. It was, in its own small way, one of the earliest examples of a luxury good being built as much on marketing and prestige as on the product itself. Frozen water, cut from an obscure pond most Londoners could never have located on a map, had become a status symbol purely because of the story attached to it. The 20th century's great conflicts left their mark on the history of ice as well. During both world wars, industrial capacity, fuel, and metal that might otherwise have gone toward refrigeration equipment were redirected toward the war effort, and in several countries the production of both natural and artificial ice was restricted or rationed alongside food and fuel. In parts of Europe under wartime shortages, families once again found themselves relying on cellars, window boxes, and whatever traditional methods of keeping food cool they could improvise, a strange echo of centuries past. In the United States, meanwhile, wartime demand for refrigeration in military logistics, keeping blood plasma, medicine, and food supplies cold for troops stationed across different climates, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific, pushed refrigeration engineering forward at a rapid pace. Portable and more efficient cooling units developed for military use during the war fed directly into the post-war boom in affordable home refrigerators, in much the same way that other wartime technologies quietly reshaped civilian life once peace returned. The soldier who kept his rations cold in a field cooler in 1944 was, without knowing it, part of the same engineering lineage that would put an automatic ice maker into ordinary kitchens within just a few years. And then, in a twist that would have delighted Frederic Tudor himself, ice became fashionable again, deliberately, expensively, and by choice. Beginning in the early 2000s, high-end cocktail bars in cities like Tokyo, New York, and London started rediscovering something that industrial ice makers had long since made irrelevant. The difference between cloudy, air-bubbled ice and perfectly clear, dense ice, carved by hand into large cubes or spheres for a single glass of whiskey. Bartenders began using directional freezing techniques, essentially reinventing, on a small scale, the same physics that Persian engineers and Massachusetts ice cutters had once wrestled with, in order to produce a single, flawless block of ice that melts slowly and dilutes a drink evenly. Specialized companies now exist solely to manufacture and sell these oversized, jewel-clear ice cubes to upscale bars, and a single hand-cut sphere of ice can cost more than the drink poured over it. In Japan, some bartenders train for years to master the traditional technique of carving a perfect ice ball using nothing but a pick and a block of factory ice, an art form treated with the same reverence once reserved for calligraphy or tea ceremony. It is a strange and fitting loop in the story. The very thing that was industrialized, mechanized, and made virtually free over the course of 2 centuries has, in one narrow but visible corner of the modern world, become a luxury item once again. Proof that even the most ordinary substance can be dressed back up in the language of exclusivity, if enough craft and story are poured into it. The Persian builder laying clay bricks under the desert sun could never have imagined that one day cold would be produced inside a kitchen cabinet at the press of a button. Frederic Tudor, who lost money on his desperate first voyage to Martinique, could not have known that within less than a century the entire global empire of frozen water he had built would vanish, replaced by a compressor the size of a kettle. The laborers who risked their lives every winter on the ice of Walden Pond had no idea that their dangerous, grueling labor would one day be entirely replaced by a small electric motor humming quietly inside a white metal box. Today, the global market for ice production and refrigeration equipment is valued in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Yet ice itself has become such a cheap, disposable commodity that in most developed countries it is handed out for free alongside a soda at any fast food counter. The journey from a Persian ice tower reserved for kings, and a 4-month ocean voyage affordable only to wealthy colonial officials, to a free cup of ice at a roadside drive-through is a journey spanning nearly 2,500 years. Everything that was once a privilege of power and a mark of wealth, everything for which slaves once climbed mountain trails and investors once risked bankruptcy sending ships halfway around the world, eventually became something so ordinary that a person tossing ice cubes into a glass of lemonade on a hot summer afternoon never stops to think that they are holding the result of 2,000 years of humanity's pursuit of cold. Not bad for frozen water.